Hi, Ben here, and welcome back to a very sunny work in progress Wednesday. We've got the sun shining through the big workshop doors, and this is a really nice place to work first thing in the morning. So I've got some blades prepped, and I've also got some handles prepped for glue up. There's just a few little processes that I need to do first before I go on to mixing up some epoxy. So I thought it'd be just a good idea to show you what goes into getting the perfect bond on those handles to make the ultimate bushcraft knife. So we've got a Whittler blade on this particular model. So what I've got here is I've got the blade prepped, it's got the final grinds on there, and what I've done is I've also prepped the handles, and at this stage I've prepped the front of the scales so they're absolutely totally finished. I've even buffed those so they've got a really good finish, and I've also put some little counter bores into the underside of the handle. Now you might think, what the heck are they for? All they do is add surface area and add areas where the epoxy can bond to. So that's going to make a really good adhesion on the inside of the handle. I've also made sure that they're totally flat, sanded them back so it's all totally flat on the inside of the handle scales. And at this stage, I like to actually just do a little final dry fit to make sure that, one, all the holes line up properly, and also just check that it's going to look sort of correct really. At this stage, if you needed to adjust the angle of the front of your handle, you could. If you suddenly realised that you'd actually sort of made the handle too long and it actually went over your grind lines and things like that, at this stage you can change it, but that's looking pretty damn good now. So at that stage I can then do the final process, which is to counterbore these holes for the loveless bolts that are going to go in there. So obviously make sure that you use the right size counterbore for the right size hardware. But also, to make this a little bit safer now, what I tend to do is cover the blade. I want to make sure that I obviously don't damage that cutting edge, but also so I'm a bit more protected as well. So I normally just give it a little wipe down with a slightly moistened rag with a bit of oil or a bit of WD-40, and then I'm actually going to use a bit of tape to cover up that blade. Don't go right over where the handle's going to go, but just over that bevel like so, and then just give it a little wrap all the way around like so. Perfect. So we've got those counter bores done, and these will fit the 1/4 inch loveless bolts perfectly. So you've got that 1/4 inch hole on the top, but only going so far through, so you've got that little shelf, and that's going to squeeze that whole handle scale onto the knife to make a really strong mechanical fit. So now what we need to do is we need to make sure that all of this is totally clean and degreased. So I'm going to clean this down with some isopropanol alcohol first, get the grease off, and then I'm going to use acetone on both the blade and the handle scales and all the hardware as well to make sure that it's totally grease free, so that you get a really good bond with the epoxy that we're going to use. So now we're ready to mix the epoxy. I don't use tomato ketchup and mustard for gluing my knives together. These are just some new sauce bottles that I've decanted some of my G-Flex epoxy into it. And it's a 2-part epoxy. Now you'll see some people will actually weigh this. But if you weigh the 2 parts of the epoxy, the hardener has got a different density to the resin. So you actually need to go by volume, not by weight. So normally what I do is I just do 2 equal lengths of epoxy like so out of my sauce bottles, and then I've got my mixing spatula, and you want to give that a really good mix. So the great thing about G-Flex is it's got a long open time. Now an open time is basically the time that you've got to use it by. It doesn't start sort of going sort of too goopy until about sort of 45-50 minutes, or almost an hour, depending on the time of the year and the temperature. So you've got plenty of time to work with it. When you're new to knife making, if you try and use 5-minute epoxy, you think, oh, 5 minutes I can assemble a knife in that time. You can't. Everything starts to go wrong. So give it a good old mix, and it should be that sort of equal, even colour. And now we are ready to start gluing up the knife. Now you'll notice also that I've got gloves on. That's not only to stop the glue going on my hands, it's also, now that I've degreased all my components, I don't want to put any of the grease from my fingers onto those components. So basically my hands are clean, and obviously when you finish gluing up you can get rid of your gloves as well. So yeah, that's ready to go. So we've got that glue mixed up nicely, and what we want to do is we want to put a nice coating on both sides of the handle scales, getting it into those divots that we put on the inside of the handle. We also want to put some on the tang of the knife as well. This just makes sure that we've got a good coating of glue everywhere. It's almost better to have too much on there than not enough. You get the feel of it after a few years of making knives. You get the feel of how much you actually need. So we're going to put that on that scale, like so. And then also, and this is why I like this little custom mixing stick that I've got, I've made it the right diameter so I can actually get glue into my holes as well. So we want to make sure that we've got a coating of epoxy in those counterbores for the loveless bolts, and also the thong tube, and this side. Like I say, you can never have too much. It gets a bit like a kid with a jar of jam at this stage. You're absolutely covered in it. And I also got my clean hardware that I've washed in acetone, and I make sure that I've got a bit of extra epoxy on those as well. Squeeze those in, like so. And then we get a little bit on that thong tube. Push that through. And I don't know what it is, I can only do it in a particular order. If I try and put the bolts in the other side of the handle scales, it just can't do it. So I'll make sure that that front bolt goes through that hole. You locate it with that thong tube, and then we'll just put those threaded sleeve nuts for the other side of the loveless bolts into this scale. Oops. These are actually the fiddliest ones, the 1/4 inch. They're a little bit smaller and a little bit harder for my big fat fingers to grip. Making sure that we've got plenty of glue on there, and then we can start to slide that together then, just like so. And I tend to use a cordless drill or a cordless screwdriver. Just makes it a little bit faster. Make sure you get both bolts started before you tighten it up. And you might find that these sleeve nuts this side spin slightly at this stage, but you normally can just about grip them enough with your fingers. And I normally set this to a torque setting so that it doesn't go super duper tight. You want to make sure that you leave a sufficient amount of glue in there. But I still like to sort of finish them off with a screwdriver, because you just get the sort of the right feel for it then, really. Just like so. And if you find that your sleeve nuts are still spinning on the other side, I normally get an extra screwdriver. You can sort of jab those in, just so that you can get enough purchase so that you can tighten those up. And you can see that your screwdrivers get a little bit goopy over the years, so have a dedicated set of screwdrivers for your glue up. And you can see it sort of pushes any air bubbles out of that gap between the handle material and the tang of the knife. And this is a good sign. See how we're getting this sort of beading of glue all along the tang? That means that we've got a sufficient amount of glue in there. And the glue acts not only to bond the handle on there, we've got the mechanical fit of the Loveless bolts, but this is going to create that waterproof seal as well to make that handle totally impervious to the elements as well. So you could leave it on there, but because it's got such an open time, the epoxy, you'll find that it'll run everywhere. So normally what I do is I just take off some of that excess, and you can get a bit of kitchen roll and just take off some of that extra glue, like so. Oops. And then normally what I do is get a clean piece. You might need to take it out the jaws of the vise slightly, and you can see that we've got that bead of epoxy at the front of the handle. Now this is where it gets tricky really, because you want to make sure that you leave glue, but you also want to clean it up while it's still wet. So we go in there with a bit of clean paper towel, carefully wipe that away on both sides. Just like so. And then this was a sort of tip. I used to use acetone then to clean up that extra glue from that area, but what I found was if you use acetone, because it's an alcohol and it evaporates, it would almost like wick the glue from underneath the handle scales. So this was actually a tip that was given to me by my mate Patrick Doyle, is to get some paper towel that you've just put a light coating of WD-40 on there, and then just clean up those front of the scales with a bit of WD-40. Now what that does is it cleans off any of that epoxy, but it also leaves a very thin coating of oil that creates like a barrier to stop the glue wicking out, and if any does wick out, you've got like a little bit of oil on there and you can sort of almost peel the glue off. It won't bond to your knife or your handle scales. So yeah, thank you Pat for that. It was a great tip. Now final thing before we put some clamps on it is you see that we've got lots of goopy epoxy in those thong tubes. So this is where little cotton buds are really handy. You can push that through, take out the excess glue, and I normally dip one end with a bit of WD again and just clean out that epoxy, just like so. And then I've got some out already. Just a few little spring clamps, nothing too excessive. One at the back I normally put, and then two at the front, just like that, just to give a bit of extra purchase. And you'll probably see that it'll just push an ever so slightly tiny bit more epoxy out, and that's pretty much it. You could leave it in the vise if you wanted to, but obviously if you're doing multiple knives, take it out the vise. I normally lay it on one of these non-stick mats for baking. It means you don't get all your knives bonded to the workbench. So hopefully that shows you the level of detail that goes into the actual handle sort of assembly part of the knife making. We endeavour to give the absolute ultimate bond to whatever handle material we're using, so that you've got a knife that's going to last a lifetime really. So that's what we're working on this week. We've got probably another 3 to glue up, then I'll clean up that epoxy, and then I can move on to other tasks while those knives are basically drying and curing over the next 24 hours. So hope you enjoy seeing what we're working on in the workshop each week. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you next week for another Work in Progress Wednesday.